where you are. So my name is Stephen High. I'm a professor of history here at Concordia University in Montreal. A nice spring day, early spring, no leaves yet, unlike I know some places. So we have a great lineup of people, seven presenters, none of whom have actually presented at a Depot online roundtable before. And I think this is a great opportunity for us to also hear from some newer voices in the project, but also bringing in other parts of the world. We have a number of people here who are focusing on Eastern Europe, and that brings in a very, I think, important dimension into the overall conversation. We have China, and of course, the United States. I think that's the range. So it's a nice mix. It's decentering a little bit. The UK, France, well, not West Germany, Italy, Canada, which have been very central to the conversation so far. And so we've got I think two presentations on the United States, which is great. The US has been oddly sort of underrepresented in the project for whatever reason. And so I think it's great that we have two presenters today who'll be bringing us into the industrial Midwest and Pennsylvania for the most part. What we're going to do is we're limiting people as per usual to 7 or 8 minutes. It's 7 minutes. I give a minute sort of leeway before sort of dropping the or clanging my gavel or whatever. And so these are short presentations that give us a taste of people's research and some of the questions that they're grappling with in their own work. So we'll start off with Yuan Yi, who's a colleague of mine here at Concordia. She's assistant professor of history, and her current book project, Machine and Knowledge, The Global Making of the Chinese Cotton Industry, examines the mechanization of cotton spinning in China with emphasis on the trans-Pacific circulation of spinning machines, cotton varieties, and technical experts. And so I think she's also bringing in like a longer historical view, right, than is often the case in the project when we tend to focus on the 1950s onward. Yuan, over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for inviting me today. And let me share my screen first. Are you able to see it? Okay, perfect. So today I'm going to talk more about my second book project. It's a kind of a continuation of the questions that I raised in my first book project. So as a historian of China, I am very interested in, the counter arguments to linear progression of history, say from, can I go next? From, feudalism to capitalism and early modern to modern. And in our case, from pre-industrial to industrial and deindustrial. So in these universalizing narratives, China and many other non-Western societies are often presented as, latecomers to this inexorable path towards development, progress, and modernity. Then I find myself perplexed a little when teaching, the history of Chinese porcelain, the Chinese silk and tea, and many other commodities that were made in China and were coveted by consumers from, the global market in the so-called early modern or pre-modern or pre-industrial era. What kinds of industry are they? How do I define and present them historiographically? Are they all pre-industrial? Or then what's the definition of industrial? And well, there's no singular industrialization, as just as there's no singular deindustrialization. We all know that. And yet, industrialization has carried a somewhat restrictive, narrow connotation of the 18th century British experience, characterized by mechanization, factories, and, the working class, oftentimes urban male wage labor. Well, Scholars have, of course, striven to provide more layers to the history of industrialization, for instance, by proposing, what's known as the Second Industrial Revolution as a distinctive phenomena that took place, later at the turn of the 20th century, mostly in the US and primarily in the steel, chemical, and automobile industries, in much larger scale than the first one. Nonetheless, the powerful tenets that define the British industrialization, such as the factory system and the white male wage worker, they continue to uphold the second one as well. And this powerful connotation, in a way, informs the study of what comes after that, that is deindustrialization. And well, as Stephen High has criticized here and there, the field tends to focus more on, the male-dominated industries like mining, steel, steelmaking, and automobile manufacturing. And yeah, at the same time, perhaps as a response to Stevens and other scholars' call, more recent case studies emerging in our own field capture the complexities of deindustrialization, presenting it as a much broader process that has happened in many non-conventional industrial sectors, including rural, agricultural, or aquaculture settings, and involving both men and women. So it's a really interesting recent development. And all these, industries do not necessarily fit into the conventional definition of, conventional model of industrialization. And yet, they just make perfect sense in the context of deindustrialization. So I see, well, deindustrialization as an analytical category seems to be more capacious than the term of industrialization. Now I build on this recent scholarship of the industrialization, and then I shift the focus not only spatially, but also temporally. I mean, if we can discuss all this, the dismantling and the disappearance of these non-conventional industrial sectors in the context of deindustrialization, what about those industries, Chinese porcelain, Chinese tea, silk, that existed before the emergence of machine-driven factory system? So I make a sweeping shift to the 17th to 19th centuries to examine the rise and fall of Nankin industry, framing it as a story of industrialization and then deindustrialization. I want to see what kind of intervention that approach can make to our understanding of the history of China and the world. So this my second book project, tentatively titled Yellow Cotton, Biodiversity and Material Culture in the Era of Hand Weaving. It examines the rise and fall of nankin. This is a fabric hand woven out of cotton varieties native to Nanjing, China. So it's characterized by its naturally yellow shade and very sturdy texture, and it was major export item from China to Europe and the Americas, and eventually to the U.S. From the 17th to 19th centuries. It was a popular material for men's trousers, and sorry, I forgot to. Yeah. Men's trousers and waistcoats. It was also made into women's dresses and shoes. While eagerly importing nankin from China, the Americans strove to reproduce it by dyeing cotton nankin, or by growing nankin cotton plants, thus gradually expanding the meaning of nankin to include, dyes and cotton plants from which they could achieve this, the natural yellow shade. All these efforts to produce and reproduce a natural hue that is no longer appreciated today because we just love pure white cotton. It formed a critical part of the Trans-Pacific trade in the pre-industrial era. By reconstructing a bygone industry in which Chinese farmers grew now endangered cotton varieties and spun and wove them by hand for faraway markets that coveted the sturdy yellowish fabric, this project illuminates how global capitalism worked without machines, but all through the exploitation, first, natural resources, that's the cotton. Second, mobilization of labor, the agricultural labor of cotton farmers in China. And third, the production and reproduction and dissemination of relevant knowledge. And yet, although exploitative by many accounts, this industry, this nankin industry, allowed different cotton varieties and species to thrive. The demise of nankin industry coincided with the emergence of machine spinning, well, in the 18th century, British as a starting point, which ushered in the monoculture of select cotton varieties with long and white fibers that's suitable for the new production system. So the history of nankin challenges one of the major fundamental assumptions that we have about cotton. Cotton is white, when it was not actually. So this project illuminates when and why cotton became white and ponders if we can bring back cotton, well, nankin cotton not only in text, but also in reality as an alternative cotton regime to restore biodiversity in the face of the global climate crisis. And here, approaching its end or demise in the 19th century as deindustrialization, rather than one of the many disappearing pre-industrial, traits, is very helpful and illuminating. It pushes us, well, me, to fundamentally rethink the familiar periodization that had shaped the linear history of China and the world. And second, it allows us to look at its end not as something inevitable, but as an outcome of numerous political, social, cultural, and economic choices that people made at the time. So I look forward to sharing my findings. I just embarked on this research. I look forward to sharing my findings in the coming years, all of you in this room. And well, if any of you are interested in revisiting, the pre-modern or early modern industries in the context of deindustrialization, please be in touch. I'd be happy to talk and collaborate. And especially for those folks based in Europe and UK, if you ever run into museum items or documents that mention Nankin, please, I'd really, really appreciate if you could let me know by email. So thank you very much.
Well, that was great. So thinking about deindustrialization without machines, right? And really expanding, our chronology or our time frame in terms of thinking about this as an integral part of sort of global capitalism. Reminded a little bit by some of the work in India, right, where there's linkages with the expansion of the British Empire and the deindustrialization of traditional sort of textile industries in India and some of the debates around that within the Indian historiography. But good stuff. So I'm sure there's going to be others who are going to want to connect with you. Next up is Anna Ruth Guildea, who's a PhD student at the Department of Political Science and Sociology at Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence, Italy. Her PhD project examines the relationship between deindustrialization and masculinity, specifically in relation to far-right voting in Western European countries. From 2021 to 2023, she was at Peking University, where she studied the political economy of labor demand in China's increasingly automated manufacturing and industrial sectors. And I had a great conversation with her in Glasgow as we were walking between meetings. And so she's coming at this in a different way than many people, but I think it's really, really a rich approach. So over to you, Anna. Yeah.
Thanks, Stephen. Let me try and share my screen somehow.
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Anna. I'm coming to you from Florence today. I'm currently in the second year of my PhD, so I'm going to be trying to run through some of the framework and some preliminary empirical work I've done so far. The elevator pitch I've been articulating about my research is that I'm trying to connect three quite separate but very interconnected bodies of research in modern political sociology. The first is that which links radical rights support in contemporary Europe to very particular occupational groups. The second is linking radical rights support to gender, particularly men and their masculinity. And the last is more seminal sociological labor theory, which has long connected occupation and gender as heavily interconnected. Employment is a very gendered experience. And I think this is where deindustrialization studies come in quite clearly. I think they add a lot of substantive kind of meat to the bones of what is otherwise very cut and dry, dependent variable, independent variable work that characterizes a lot of modern social science research, unfortunately. My research question requires further tinkering, but at the moment I'm working with how does the masculine gender identity and particular occupations interact with one another, and how are these linked to support for the radical right among men in contemporary Europe? So to fly through these bodies of work, the first has pointed to salient sources of radical right support as emanating from specific occupational groups. And it should come as no surprise, these are generally characterized by their so-called low skill level or the highly routinized aspect of their task content. So this literature is often using the phrase skill-biased technical change to kind of illustrate that these forms of work are disproportionately impacted by forces like automation, digitization, robotization. I feel it's just a euphemism for deindustrialization and kind of illustrates how these bodies of work are quite divorced from one another, unfortunately. And I think this research also displays over and over again that there's a very weak explanatory power of objective economic variables in explaining who supports the radical right within these occupational groups. Radical right supporters are not generally experiencing measurable forms of income decline or increased job precarity, for example. Those who do within these occupational groups generally abstain from voting or come to support further left parties. And so to explain the mechanism of radical right supporters and their political behavior, this research is generally reliant on more relational understandings of like perceptions of economic threat or status loss. And I think one of the major limits of this research is that it neglects the fact that the occupational groups that come forward again and again as empirically relevant have been historically very masculine forms of work. And I think this is kind of the irony going on here, to kind of reiterate what Yuan said during her presentation. There's maybe this critique in deindustrialization literature of overemphasis and overfocus on men, whereas I think contemporary political sociological literature that's trying to look at who supports the radical right and why is neglecting the role of masculinity. And we need to bring that back into the picture a bit. So this second body of work that looks at gender and radical rights support has nodded to the gender gap in this electorate. There's an overrepresentation of men, and how there is clearly a distinctive racialized gender conservatism that runs through the party family. So this masculinity, this gendered aspect runs through the radical right, both representationally and ideologically. I think there's a lot of conceptual groundwork to be done here when we use the term masculinity. What do we mean? If men are overrepresented in nearly every form of public politics, how do we differentiate that one specific political entity as distinctively masculine? That's one of the limits, I would say, characterizing this work right now. I'm still working through my own concepts and how I'm using them. I also think this work also shies away inversely from the socioeconomic. It doesn't engage really with labor theory that much either. So this is where I'm pointing to the labor sociology theory. I'm looking at work by those such as David Collinson or Cynthia Cockburn, more classics in this field, who point to changing technology, disrupting established forms of occupational organization, and this goes on to change gender relations. And all of this illustrates the fragility of masculinity with the decline of historically masculine jobs. And the centrality of the workplace for the construction and the expression and the enactment of manhood, and how different men react to this differently. And this returns us again to concepts like status loss and aggrievement. So throughout my second year, I've been focusing on quantitative methods. So unfortunately, going back to that cut and dry, dependent, independent variable type of work that I hope will go on to inform future qualitative work where I get out into the field and start interviewing some people. I've been using European social survey data from the most recent round last year, which includes 13 countries with over 1,800 radical right voters. This data has some really valuable, first of its kind, gender-related survey items where respondents are being asked to kind of subjectively rank their own feeling of their own level of masculinity or femininity, which I think is very interesting and original. This is a bit of an assault on the senses right here, all of the tables. I apologize, but from this data, we can see that, as is expected, certain occupational groups are overrepresented within the radical right constituency compared to other party families. However, in this most recent data, we can see that groups like production workers that have historically been very overrepresented are less overrepresented in 2024. And other groups such as sociocultural professionals that have been historically underrepresented and considered ideologically opposed to the radical right are less underrepresented. And I think this speaks to the proliferation and the normalization of the radical right in contemporary Europe. And we can see this purely just by the fact that the number of radical right voters in 2024 has effectively doubled from 2014 in this sample. We can see that respondents who identify as highly masculine, who are men, are overrepresented within the radical right constituency as well. However, women who identify as highly feminine are not overrepresented. And I think this speaks to the fact that this is not an effect of individuals who identify with traditional or normative ideation of their gender identity being more likely to support more conservative party families. I think this is an effect that's specific to men and specifically in relation to their masculinity, which is important. And lastly, we can see that men who identify as highly masculine are also overrepresented in the same occupational groups who are overrepresented in the radical right constituency. So I ran some predicted probability models. This is a very busy graph. I apologize again. We can kind of isolate specific occupational groups, and we can see that across the board, more masculine men in different occupational groups are more likely to support the radical right, but this comes forward in a much more dramatic way in particular groups. We see here production workers, for example, technical professionals, small business owners, for example. This last group I think is particularly interesting. We can see service workers, the more masculine they identify as, they become much more likely to support the radical right, which is very interesting given, in the literature, service workers are generally identified as supporters of the left. So this is, I don't know if interesting is the right word, maybe worrying would be more appropriate. I have a lot more quantitative work to do, and I'm very limited with the type of data that I have and the methods that are available to me. So this is just cross-sectional data. It looks at one point in time in 2024, and it disallows me from being able to engage with arguably more interesting effects that are going on here. Are more masculine men drawn to particular occupations in the first place that adhere to their understanding of their gender identity? Are particular men socialized into specific forms of masculinity as they become employed in certain forms of work? I think the seminal sociological theory that I'm looking at would suggest that this is also the case. Hopefully all of this work, as I said, can inform future research I want to do. This September, I will be joining the Political Masculinities research group in the University van Amsterdam, and I hope to get out into the field in the Netherlands and start targeting workplaces, interviewing men who are employed there, who I expect will be PVV voters. We'll see how that all goes. Yeah, I'll wrap it up there. Hopefully that was under 7 minutes. Thank you.
Well, that was great. No, and again, it reminds us of the value of a field that's actually interdisciplinary, right? That we come at it in different ways with different kinds of source bases, different kinds of questions, different methods, but it all helps and builds our understanding. And again, I got loads of questions around like, country differences or how the qualitative and quantitative will sort of mesh. I think that's always a big challenge. But yeah, really, really interesting. Thank you so much. Next up, sort of on a similar theme, I had the sequence in mind. They were like connectors between different people. So next up is Cory Haala. Is a professor of political history at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. His manuscript in progress with the University of Illinois Press is called How Democrats Won the Heartland, Progressive Populism in the Age of Reagan. I had to reread that title. I thought, won the heartland? I thought they lost the heartland, but of course that's what he's doing, right? It argues that grassroots activists applied the historical principles of left populist parties to revive working class solidarities that transcended rural, urban, racial, gender, and other divides. Cory, over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for everybody for being here. Learning a lot about the world. I'm really grateful to these studies and to deindustrial studies in particular have challenged some of the ways that I look at my own research and challenge some of kind of the perspectives that I'll be talking about today. So again, thanks Stephen for organizing this. To Liam. And hopefully bringing a kind of a different perspective here, perhaps from maybe the Western of some of the folks who've been involved in Depot in the past. And so I erred a little bit in my title, which for many of my subjects in the American Midwest is a story from farm to factory rather than vice versa. But my research, as you hopefully can see on the map here, explores the upper Midwest, the northwestern reaches of the American Midwest that I define as, for right now, as Iowa, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wisconsin. And I'll come back to why those 5 states for another reason as well in just a moment. But this is a reason where we talk or we understand that in the 1980s, this is an era of simultaneous crises in farming and in industry. And so part of what my work contends is that we should be understanding how folks who were fighting against the problems of deindustrialization, how those folks fighting back against deindustrialization built solidarities and renewed solidarities along historic lines of farm labor cooperation. So the 1970s into the 80s, as you can see from the slide, I hope, is one of crisis, but in 2 ways, really. And it's not just that there is the kind of the more traditional, I suppose, narratives of deindustrialization that we think about in the Midwest, the Rust Belt, auto manufacturing and steel industries on the decline, but this reaches as well into across the Great Lakes and then ripples into the countryside here in the Midwest. Um, Unemployment on Minnesota's Iron Range, an iron ore producing region that ships across the Great Lakes, reaches 80% in 1982-83. In some industries, more traditionally, places like auto manufacturers like Chrysler closed plants in Kenosha, Wisconsin in 1988. But it's worth noting that this is also a moment where the farm economy collapses in the Midwest. Richard Nixon's Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, had encouraged farmers in the 1970s to, quote, get big or get out, to plant fence row to fence row, to put it another way, because the United States was shipping greater and greater quantities of grain to the Soviet Union in the 1970s. So farmers quickly leveraged land, took out new loans, bought new implements, and really tried to expand their operations. And as that supply grew and grew and grew, land values soared. High rates of debt persisted in the American Midwest, and that all began to pop in the late 1970s, really spurred on in 1980 when President Jimmy Carter made the decision to embargo shipments of American grain to the Soviet Union. The bubble quickly burst, as you can see from the tumbling values of land prices there in the bottom right-hand corner. Land values dropped. Farm foreclosures, like one of Ken Massey in Middleton, Wisconsin, grabbed headlines with kind of the dead-eyed face that you see there of an American farmer, one that paralleled in many ways to some of the faces and some of the experiences that we tend to talk about in the urban or in the industrial Midwest and around the industrial world. This was one as well that was characterized then by collapses in other industrial occupations related to the farm economy, as oversupply hurt the farm economy, as prices dropped. For farmers, so too did farming-related industries like meatpacking and implement dealing struggle. The 1980s here in the Upper Midwest are characterized particularly by industrial strife. Meat packers being locked out at the Hormel plant in Austin, Minnesota, a strike that lasted over a year. As well as in the John Deere strike in Waterloo and in Dubuque, Iowa, that lasted the better part of 1986 and 87. And we see changes in the ways in which industrial relations, in which union bargaining proceeds in the 1980s. And that includes national bargaining units tending to be more conciliatory, tending to work abandon some of the pattern bargaining that they'd employed through the 1950s and 60s, and really encourage locals to take the deal, to accept the wage cuts. And so this was largely one that as locals in the Midwest, like P9 at Hormel, began to rebel and began to try to go on strike in defiance of their national union. We start to see that deindustrialization really hitting home in the heartland, but also then being compared. Both the collapse of family farming here in the Upper Midwest, as well as some of the unemployment on the Iron Range near Duluth, Minnesota, as you can see in the top right-hand corner, as well as elsewhere, being compared to the early 1930s. Very explicitly and intentionally comparing these crises in farming and in industry to the Great Depression. and beginning to organize, as you see here, unemployment councils being ways of not only giving moral support, but blocking evictions, keeping utilities on for folks who couldn't pay the bills, really intentionally reviving some of those tactics that had been used in the Great Depression. And as it turns out, there's a really rich and a long tradition of that kind of farm labor solidarity and farm labor organizing here in the Upper Midwest. Without perhaps boring you with the details or running through every single one of these groups, and admitting that I'm being very Midwest-centric here, with all apologies to the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation of the Prairie Provinces, and the New Democratic Party, of course, to our Canadian friends in the room. This is the American analog. So looking at both the Populist Party, perhaps William Jennings Bryan and his Cross of Gold speech, but at taking on really specific state iterations here in the Midwest. The North Dakota Nonpartisan League in particular, established in 1915, seizes power of the state, control of the state's politics, and by 1919 has created a state-owned bank, something that does not exist anywhere else in the United States. It still exists today, for as Republican red as North Dakota has turned, they still love their state bank and their state mail and elevator. Just a little bit of socialism as a treat for the good people of North Dakota. But these are things that ripple into states like Minnesota with the Farmer Labor Party, Wisconsin with the Progressive Party of Wisconsin, a short-lived political party that lasts about 12 years there. Traditions that you can see here talk about prosperity starting with the common people. Talking about this as a working class kind of identity, both in name for the Farmer Labor Party, but then in the actions that they took as well. The problem was by the late 1970s, early 80s, these kinds of traditions, trends are if not dead, they're at least dormant. And by 1980, in the two elections that would bring Ronald Reagan into office, but a host of state, local, federal officials that were new right Republicans as well, tax slashing, culture warriors. You can see Democrats lost a number of U.S. Senate seats. 7 is a great deal when you consider there are 10 total in the Upper Midwest, a number of governorships, state legislative seats. And you have there John Podesta, an advisor to later Democratic presidents in the 2000s, admitting in 1980 we're at something of a loss for dealing with the blue-collar constituency. Democrats took their finger off the pulse of the industrial Midwest, of the rural Midwest, and of the people who voted there. And yet, over the course of the next 10 years, activists rebuilt at the local and at the regional level here in the Midwest by re-emphasizing the little guy, by re-emphasizing the little gal, and re-emphasizing ways in which the Midwest had a farm industrial heritage that was rooted in a class-based politics. And so where I try to intervene in my research is that in current political historiography here in the U.S., there's strong emphasis on the rise of neoliberalism. Right, government choosing new winners in the markets. Folks like Atari Democrats, or now yesterday I learned that there's something called a Waymo Democrat, apparently, pivoting to the newest high tech, the newest industrial policy, and so on. Deindustrial studies show us that there's a really fruitful way of challenging those narratives of declension, of rightward swing, instead looking at those who reimagined a post-industrial or a reindustrialized Midwest. Some of these things were events like the Farm Labor Solidarity Day that was held at the UAW local 838 hall in Waterloo, Iowa. A Black Nebraska state senator exhorted the crowd that, quote, farmers need to realize that they'll be picked off one by one, just as unions will be picked off one by one until there are no more. That dovetailed with rallies that were held in Gary, Indiana, as well as one that began in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and drove 2.5 hours north to Duluth, Minnesota, bringing farmers and Black community leaders with them up to a deindustrializing kind of region of Minnesota, and sought to build political power and to do it through talking around multiple issues, to do it through emphasizing and identifying multi-issue kinds of organizing, finding things like trade that they could rally around, that you can see here, rural farming organizations as well as unions hosting events that pushed back against or were critical of free trade agreements like the North American Free Trade Agreement of eventually 92. And the last thing that I want to emphasize is that this did trickle upwards into democratic and liberal politics here in the United States. You can see at the bottom right hand a kind of a legendary Minnesota senator named Paul Wellstone, who first ran for office not for the Senate in 1990, his famous run, but ran for a state level position called state auditor in 1982, and ran on the platform that he wanted to create a state-owned bank. That's not the role of the auditor in Minnesota. That's not the role of really anything. But he revived some of these ideas, and everybody's looking at him like, "What the hell are you talking about, man?" And yet, it didn't get him over the finish line, but it at least kind of framed this cause in that of economic populism. And he explicitly talked to farmer labor traditions. At the top right-hand corner of the screen, you can see a bibliography shared by Tom Harkin of Iowa, who eventually had become a senator from Iowa in 1984. And any PhD student in the U.S. Studying populism will recognize a few of these titles up here. Quite literally using these historical traditions to make history. The last person, maybe at the bottom left-hand corner there as well, 1988 presidential candidate Jesse Jackson, who in the United States worked explicitly with farm organizers and farm activists in rural Iowa, marched arm in arm with strikers at the Cudahy meatpacking plant in Milwaukee, which you can see there at the again at the bottom left-hand corner, and really adopted and embraced many of these ideas of what they called explicitly progressive populism, building it from the grassroots up, emphasizing solidarities between rural and urban organizers, and using them to, if not completely transform politics, at least to show or to reimagine politics in the Midwest and in the United States, that there possibly could, in fact, be another way. Thank you.
Well, it sounds like it's going to be a great book, and I love the connections you're making between farmer and labor solidarity. It reminds me of like John Cougar Mellencamp, and of course, we often in our field talk a lot about Springsteen, but not too much about John Cougar and how these two, of course, were happening basically at the same time, and how there's linkage. And I'm from Thunder Bay, Ontario, just across the Canadian border from these areas, and so I've been to Brainerd, I've been to these places that you talked about. So this is great stuff, and it's also hopeful, right? It's also, focusing on an alternative politics that's sort of been submerged for some time now, right? But can be reconnected with. So thank you for that. Next up, we have Nora Küttel, who's currently at the University of Halle. She currently researches and teaches at the Institute of Geosciences and Geography. In her postdoctoral project, she is interested in the multiple transformation and crises of labor in East German shipyards over the past 35 years. Her current project investigates the multiple transformations of East German shipyards and is particularly interested in the intersections of labor, loss, and space. And we haven't heard much about Eastern Germany thus far. We hear a lot about Germany in this project, but it's usually the Ruhr Valley. And I think East Germany provides a very different lens to understand sort of the German dimension of what we're talking about here. So over to you, Nora, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. I hope you can see my presentation.
Yeah, perfect.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So in this presentation today, I'll share insights from my research on the emotional and social consequences of deindustrialization in East Germany's shipbuilding industry after reunification. And I'm building on earlier work in this field and argue that deindustrialization, as I guess all of you know, is not only about job losses or plant closures, it's also about how large-scale economic shifts are lived, felt, and remembered by workers and communities over time. So my study focuses on how former shipyard workers experienced, interpret, and recall these massive transformations. And in doing so, it aims to highlight the intimate, the subjective, and often overlooked impacts of deindustrialization. And to analyze these effects, I look at them through the lens of emotional geographies, which explore how emotions are tied to specific places, relationships, and power structures. Emotions are not just private feelings. They are shaped by and in return shape the social and spatial context in which they occur. And this approach highlights how industry change affects not only workers' material conditions, but also their identities, attachments, and emotional well-being. The collapse of East Germany's state-owned shipbuilding industry after 1990 brought radical changes in a short period. Privatization and restructuring led to a dramatic reduction in employment and disrupting what had long been a stable employment landscape and profoundly affected both individual lives and the social fabric of the region. In the GDR, shipyards were more than just workplaces. They were centers of everyday lives, providing childcare, healthcare, cultural events, and leisure activities. And at the same time, I feel it's important to mention as well, they served ideological functions, fostering a strong identification with work and the workplace, as well as the state. And to capture the personal experiences of this industrial transformation, my study draws on more than 30 oral history interviews with former shipyard workers, and I'll briefly give you some small insights into the results of the work. So Helga, one of my interviewees, who spent 4 decades at the shipyard, put it simply, the shipyard was part of my life. And this kind of attachment was not uncommon. Many interviews describe the shipyard as a second home or a family. And this sense of belonging was reinforced by visible achievements, such as you can see here on the slide. When a ship set sail, workers felt pride in the final product, that tangible proof of their collective efforts, as Dita, another interviewer, recalled, saying, "We were always very proud of our products. Everyone here identified with it." And while pride and identification often persisted, parts of the emotional landscape changed dramatically after reunification. In the early 1990s, privatization led to mass layoffs and uncertainty. And unemployment, which had barely existed in the GDR, became very common. Birgit, who lost her job in 1997, recalled, "Everyone thought of themselves. There was no more sense of collectivity." With the introduction of a market-oriented system, the solidarity many workers remembered gave way to competition and mistrust. People began to see each other as rivals for the few jobs that remained on the shipyard. And many described the layoffs as arbitrary and beyond their control. So those who kept their jobs often credited luck rather than merit, and underscoring the perceived randomness of survival under capitalism. Manuela, another interviewer who had to inform colleagues of their dismissals, recalled, "It was very hard for me. I became very withdrawn. Even today, so about 20 years after this, there are still people who don't greet me." And Klaus, the former Works Council member, says he still dreams about that time, even today. So the emotional toll then was not limited to those who lost their jobs. It also affected those who had to communicate or implement the decisions. And Hannes, meanwhile, learned about his shipyard's insolvency from a television broadcast while on holiday. He said, "At that moment, my world fell apart." So his experience reflects how abrupt and impersonal these changes often felt, and also the lack of communication. These stories are not just individual, they point to broader structural forces. Deindustrialization in East Germany unfolded rapidly and often without sufficient support systems, leaving behind a deep emotional aftermath of grief, of fear, confusion, and anger. And yet former workers continue to refer to the shipyards using possessive language, like "our machines, our shipyard." And I regard this as a subtle yet powerful way of reclaiming a sense of belonging and challenging the capitalist logic that treats labor as disposable. I think it reinforces collective identity, even as it underscores the limited control workers had in the face of layoffs and bankruptcies. And to me, as a geographer, labor geography provides a valuable framework for understanding these dynamics. It positions workers not as passive victims, but as active geographic agents embedded in specific places and histories. And while their agency was often constrained, it was expressed in everyday ways, through memory, through language, and through emotional ties. And at the same time, many workers also felt powerless amid abrupt restructurings. And this tension calls for a more nuanced understanding of workers' agency, one that encompasses not only visible actions like strikes or even voluntary departures, but also quieter forms such as emotional investment and mutual support among colleagues. So in conclusion, my research underscores that deindustrialization is also a deeply personal process that reshapes identities, communities, and emotional landscapes. And the shipbuilding industry in East Germany provides a vivid example of how work structures social life and how its loss produces complex emotional legacies. And by listening to former workers, by taking their emotions seriously, I uncovered dimensions of economic transformation that are otherwise invisible or remained invisible. And we see how pride coexists with grief, how nostalgia intertwines with bitterness, and how people struggle to make sense of forces beyond their control. Thank you.
Yeah, beautifully done. Like just thinking about like the complexity of motions, right? That you're by grounding in people's lives, the lived interior of the experience of deindustrialization. We get away from, some of these water debates around nostalgia as, almost like universalizing experiences, right? You're getting at here like like the complexity, but also like I liked how you talk about like how it's intimate, subjective, but it's also structural, right? It's collective, and that tension too between the two. Yeah, and the possessive language stuff was really great. So thank you so much, Nora. Next up, we got Marta Chmielewski. I'm sorry, I had it well before. She's a PhD student in the history department at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. Her research examines the transformation of the Polish bra industry and how the introduction of neoliberalism has affected production modes, property regimes, and gendered class relations. Her research also addresses memory conflicts around the 1989 privatization and how these unresolved tensions continue to shape local politics and inform everyday discourses. Marta, over to you.
Thanks so much. Can you see the presentation?
It's perfect. It's perfect.
It's perfect. Okay.
Yeah. Well,
Great.
right now it's sort of you can see both the big and the small. I'm not sure if you can like how you start. There we go. Perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Great. So thank you for the introduction and for having me here today. I'm going to be talking about my PhD, which I'm hoping to finish soon at the History Department of EUI in Florence. And it's really like what I'm going to speak definitely resonates with your presentation, Nora. So it's a great timing. So I'm going to start with a quote that kind of introduces the field and the social actors involved. Główno is the bra capital of Poland. In this town of a dozen or so thousand inhabitants, bras are made in 120 sewing rooms. They are sewn by seamstresses who used to work in a corsetry cooperative named after Włada Bytomska, a pre-war communist from Łódź. And this is a quote from the biggest daily newspaper in Poland, Gazeta Wyborcza from 1996. And it shows the topic of privatization and changes of the bra industry in Główno, Central Poland. And in my thesis, I'm definitely interested in how different forms of economic governance through rapid industrialization, globalization, like I said, privatization, and ultimately deindustrialization, reshape labor, gender, and consumption in Poland, and I frame this through the scholarship of capital investments and disinvestments, which highlight the inequality of capital and labor formations through the decades. And this is more or less my question that I'm working with. And I am approaching it also through oral history interviews. These are the 21 interviews I conducted, and I supplemented with archival research of both the cooperative and the private sector that I'm researching, and the press research. And all of this I'm researching through like a close reading of one industry in Główno, which has evolved over 8 years that I'm researching to show these tensions that I'm talking about. And it's in central Poland, as you can see on the map. And this formation of this industry, the funding date, so to speak, is 1949, when the sewing cooperative was established in Główno, which was a bottom-up, very independent enterprise that was soon absorbed into the state economy during Stalinism, into the centrally planned industrialization. While the cooperative sector, like in theory, is different from the state and the private sector, actually during state socialism in Poland, it was implemented into the central planned economy, and it kind of lost the autonomy. It was forced to be unionized into political institutions. And the same thing happened in Głowienianka case, which had to be renamed after this pre-communist hero, and had to change the way its labor was organized and how it was managed. And through this loss of autonomy, a lot of investments through the state came. And so the shop floor was built, and for this mode of production with assembly lines and standardized brass appeared more of a rigid control and discipline on the shop floor as well. In the 1970s, a state-organized subcontracting deal with a Western brand during the so-called period of détente, when Eastern Europe started to be more integrated into Western European capitalism. And through all of this, the cooperative became the biggest bra producer in Poland. In the 1980s, because of the Solidarność civil movement, so cooperative sector also gained some independence, which actually led to its first steps on deindustrialization due to the 1980s economic crisis that was spread through the country. And then in the 1990s, like after 1989, the rise of private entrepreneurship challenged the monopoly of the bra production, of the public sector bra production. Small and medium enterprises started to dominate the market in the 1990s. Especially that because of the fall of state socialism, the rising unemployment, both state and popular media propagated this idea of starting a business to avoid unemployment. The cooperative also went through restructuring, changed its names, led to decided for mass layoffs of its workers, but also started a very stable subcontracting deal with Triumph International. So this is a very popular formation of foreign capital investments in garment industry in Eastern Europe, so-called outward processing contracts, when Western European country would send its textiles and design to Eastern Europe to be sewn and then shipped back to Western Europe, so that it's still is part of the, it's not an export or import, but a subcontracting deal. And that ended in 2015. And in my PhD, I also talk about gender relations more and sexuality, but I feel like obviously there's no time for everything. And here I just have some slides that show like the organization aspect of like how complicated the cooperative sector was. Some pictures from the industrial life and in the golden days of the cooperative in the 70s. Some designs and the company that the subcontracting deal was with in the 1970s, Felina, and how this new private businesses started in Główno, introduced completely new concepts of forming a brand and advertising, and with that also different designs. And this is just a small site about Triumph International, in case you haven't heard about this multinational corporation. And the industrial question definitely comes to mind when I'm talking about the contemporary situation where the cooperative still remains a cooperative. It hasn't been closed, it's not been privatized, but it's constantly talking about bankruptcy and the struggles to keep up. Now it hires only 50 workers. Among this 100 and something private workshops, very few remain today due to the pressure of the competition with Asian producers, mostly. One large company still continues local productions, other are very limited. And this is very interesting because in general, Poland actually has increased its production, export and production of brass. It's in top 10 world producers of underwear and exporters. And it's also been more recognized. I here have a print screen of an article from New York Times when American journalists talked with Główno wrap producers, which was very important in case of with the question of international recognition. But at the same time, the employment is definitely not where it used to be. And the precarity of the labor conditions are, that's also what Nora spoke about. There's no secure workplace and there's no culture around this as it used to be. So there's a lot of frustration about that. But definitely it's not so easy to say when the deindustrialization took place, as it was more gradual and it was not really a fall or of a public sector, but rather a gradual deindustrialization over the years that was also helped with by the rise of private sector that absorbed a lot of its workers and outputs. So I'm definitely very happy to talk more about this and how to engage more with the deindustrialization studies for this part of my work. And that's all. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Marta. That was great, and it's got me thinking about like again the long view and what that offers, and again these waves of reorganization and what that does to to people's attachments, people's sort of experience of work and their connection to each other. And yeah, and so that the privatization in the 1990s and the I don't want to say collectivization, but the state sort of nationalization almost kind of, right? In an earlier wave, what does that offer? And and thinking also about like when does deindustrialization begin? Like when, like it's still going, but it's no longer 1,000 people working there, right? And so that to me is a really, really interesting question. So thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, cheers. Next up, we got Monika Glosowitz, who is an assistant professor at the University of Silesia. She specializes in literary studies with an additional research interest in feminist theories, deindustrialization studies, and environmental humanities. She has started her new research project that interrogates the invisibility of women in narratives of coal areas in Poland. I saw her give a great paper in Glasgow last summer. So, Monika, over to you.
Hi again. Just let me share my screen. I hope you can hear me. Just a second. Okay. Yeah, it's a PDF.
Yeah, all good. Yeah.
Okay. I would like to tell you about a research project which now I can call a long-term and a participatory one. But when it began, it transformed from an auto-ethnographic exploration through a local activist project into quite a collective of women writing their own social history. Sorry, just a second. Okay. Okay. I have started this project under umbrella name of Memoirs of Women from Mining Families in 2021. And in 2022, I organized first workshop here. First workshop in Czerwionka-Leszczyny, which is a commune neighboring my hometown where, oh God, sorry. Where Dębieńsko mine was closed down as early as 2000, despite the coal deposits still are still present there. At the beginning, we were gathering as 5 to 8 women and telling each other stories of our lives of wives, mothers, daughters, granddaughters, sister of miners, and what soon became clear also as women miners. That was the modest beginning of a wide-ranging project that turned into a collection of memoirs written or told by women themselves. And I have to say that I'm not using any kind of interview methods, and all the memoirs are written or told by the women themselves. It began in the small municipality and spread throughout the province, also having its lunches in the largest cities of the metropolitan area, Katowice, Bytom, Czeladź, Zabrze, and many others. The project has expanded throughout the whole Polish part of Upper Silesia region and has become a solid starting point for building an archive of women's stories of deindustrialization. It was presented in mainstream and high circulation media, also in Gazeta Wyborcza, newspapers, morning TV shows, and radios. So far, I have organized, as you can see here on the slide, 3 editions of the story competitions in competition in Poland in 2022, 23, 24, and I'm sure that I'm going to organize another one in 2025. I also organized an exhibition, 10 workshops in 6 communes, and I collected more than 50 stories so far, established cooperation with 2 local governments, with Marshal's Office of the Silesian province and about 10 cultural institutions. And what is the most significant, we published 2 editions of the book collection of memoirs, and this is the first one published in 2023. And the second one, and this is not the best picture of the cover, but it was published in 2024 by Silesian Library Publisher. We, and I say by we mean me and the authors of memoirs, so 22 women who wrote their memoirs, took part in 20 book signing meetings and public readings. And this is still not the end of our tour. We have at least 5 meetings ahead by the end of 2025. In parallel, I began to transform this local action, which at the beginning I saw mainly as feminist activist, into a scientific project. The research project, which I'm going to develop, involves archiving and compiling the narratives of women from mining families in the Upper Silesian coal basin. And this Upper Silesian coal basin, it consists of Upper Silesia, Dąbrowa, Kraków, and Ostrawa-Karwina basins. And Ostrawa-Karwina basin is on the other side of the border, so it's the Czech part of Upper Silesia. And analyzing them against the background of transnational processes of deindustrialization and decarbonization of coal regions. This broad perspective is all the more important if we view post-war history as a cycle of two successive phases, industrialization and deindustrialization. And both of them, what is important to me, are seen as modernization projects and were or have been implemented as promises to improve living conditions. And this is also important when we think about mining sector in Poland, which is going to be closed by 2049, and one of the closest mines, Kopalnia Węgla Kamiennego Chwałowice, is going to be closed as the last one in 2049. The project aims to critically reflect on the unpreserved place of women in the post-industrial cultural memory of the Upper Silesian coal basin. I will test the research hypothesis regarding the erasure of women from mining families from cultural memory and the social, political, economic, and ultimately cultural processes behind this phenomenon. I am going to outline the field of cultural memory in Upper Silesia and to answer the questions of why the stories of women from mining families are absent from it, as well as to formulate a response to this absence in the form of an Artivist part of the research project, so the archive of women's memoirs. I would like to expand the corpus of stories collected so far so that it becomes representative to the entire Upper Silesian coal basin. I believe it is necessary to supplement it with stories of women who come from, lived, and worked in the Dąbrowa, Kraków, and Ostrawa Karwina districts, so that I can problematize issues of ethnic diversity, linguistic diversity related to regional identity, and class diversity related to origin and work, and the internal hierarchy of mining workplaces. In addition to the women's autobiographical memoirs, an essential part of the research is to complete and assemble a corpus of literary stories, cultural texts written by and about women from mining families, and media narratives that also make up the entire discursive field that constructs the image of such women. Within this discursive field, the two main narrative lines can be distinguished. One related to the domestic work of women from mining families, their reproductive and caregiving roles, and the other related to women's work in the mining industry. It fits, I believe, into the broader trend of interdisciplinary research, which is the industrialization studies, and we all know that. And I quote Clark, and Wright, which has been dominated by bottom-up studies of working class people and places whose experiences have in many ways been defined by the disappearance of major sources of industrial employment. I am primarily interested in the issue of excluding the presence of women from mining families from the cultural memory of the coal region. I will first take up the challenge of placing this process in a transnational perspective. I will describe the history of mining in Upper Silesia and its peculiarities, outline the field of mining culture to map the absence of women against their background. Then I will present a case study of the project Memoirs of Women from Mining Families, outlining the correlation between socioeconomic processes and processes of cultural memory construction. As part of the implementation of the research project, I plan to create a digital archive of women's stories, and it's actually done under the address pamiętniki.pl, and so far it's exclusively in Polish, but I hope that it's going to be translated into English too. And besides the archive, the digital archive of women's stories, I plan, of course, an interdisciplinary study of the collected literary, memoir, and media narratives from the perspectives of the humanities and social sciences. So it was about 3 or even 4 years of my life in 8 minutes. So thank you.
Well, that was great. It's always a challenge to like do the 8 minute. But you get a real good sense of like how organic your process was, like beginning with sort of that collaborative work with these 21 women and the production of memoirs and the public launching of these stories. So intervening in that silence or breaking that silence around sort of women's stories within the context of a mining region. And then going outward from that, building outward. So in a way, almost like reversing how often like people approach these things. And I think that has, that has tremendous value. And certainly the Depot Project's working group on working class expression will be starting up in the coming year. And so I think this will be a really nice link to what Sherry Lee Lankin and Jackie Clark and others are also chewing on. So thanks so much, Monika. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Finally, so this is a 7-person panel. We have Melissa Mead, who I first met in 2019 at the Working Class Studies Conference in Kent, in England, just before the pandemic. Now, Melissa is an assistant professor of communication technologies at Seton Hall University, which I believe is in Pennsylvania.
No,
Her book.
it's Greater New York area now.
Okay,
New Jersey.
okay.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Metropolitan. No, that's okay. I wouldn't mind going back to Pennsylvania. It's expensive up here.
Her book project is called In the Shadow of King Coal: Memory, New Media, Identity, and Culture in the Post-Industrial Pennsylvania Anthracite region. Is that how you pronounce anthracite? I read it all the time, but I never actually say it.
Yeah, you got it. Anthracite.
Okay, my first time actually saying it, I think. So, anyways, over to you, Melissa, please.
Okay, thank you, Steve and Liam, for organizing this and all you've been doing. Monika, I am a descendant of Polish miners in Pennsylvania. My mom was going to be here, but she couldn't make the technology work. So we might have a lot of miners were recruited to work in the Pennsylvania mines from Eastern Europe, and that is a part of my project. But that isn't exactly like what I'm talking about today. My talk today is Digital Memories in Centralia, Pennsylvania, and the reshaping of labor narratives. This picture that you see on here are breaker boys, taken by Lewis Hines. Both of my grandfathers and both of the sides of my family were breaker boys. They worked as children in the mines, and that's where they began their career. I just want to show you the map of the United States. This is Pennsylvania. Jersey's next to it there. That's the state right next to it, flapped up against it. So if you look at that state, this is Pennsylvania. The pink is anthracite. Anthracite, so when we think of coal, at least in the United States, we often think of the yellow, the bituminous. It's less carbon. Anthracite's almost pure carbon. And that's what made it very unique. It has the most concentrated supply, these little pockets in Pennsylvania of anthracite coal in the world. And they fueled America's Industrial Revolution. And although this underground mining, and I like that question of when did industrialization begin that Steve was asking, kind of ended decades ago, although there are some people doing that still. We have all these strip mining operations. They cut open pits into the landscapes. And so there isn't a lot of the mining that people used to do, but it remains central to the identity of the people. And so what I have here to talk about with Centralia, Pennsylvania, which is a town adjacent to mine and went to my high school, is I want to talk about the Centralia mine fire disaster. This is a picture of Todd Dombowski. And the Centralia mine fire disaster has been burning since 1962. It started, the story is that it started on a trash disposal site igniting a coal seam. And because this is almost pure carbon, it's been burning since this time. Many people who aren't familiar, they say, well, why didn't they put it out? So you get by the late 60s, you get toxic gases like carbon monoxide and methane entering the homes there, which were mostly row homes. This critical point is when this young boy who was 12, Todd Dombowski, he nearly died in 81. And he fell into the smoking subsidence hole. That's when the ground caves into the land. And so this starts to bring national attention. So the government, to make a long story short, chooses a $42 million relocation of the town instead of like what would have been like, at the time, $660 million extinguishing cost. So what you end up with at the time is this legal battle for eminent domain. People want to stay, even though it's burning underneath. And so 6 residents finally win in 2013, and they get to stay in their houses, but not pass it on into the next generation. So what I'm investigating, and where I see a lot of relationships with my colleagues here on the panel, are competing narratives about Centralia. Outside dominant narratives that portray Centralia as a supernatural ghost town and a horror trope, where it's been commodified through a horror film called Silent Hill. I don't know if anyone's seen that film. Tourism, many people come for tourism, even though it's not a tourist site, it's been blocked off. The roads are blocked off. You can't get into the town. There's travel websites. There's focuses on aesthetics of decay and supernatural elements. It appears in all kinds of commercial tourism sites like TripAdvisor. There's local amusement park attractions versus local residential narratives that emphasize social memory of labor history, community life, personal histories and memories through digital forums that I've created, but also now there are more that community share that focus on coal mining identity, industrial decline, and the struggle to preserve community memory as these physical landmarks disappear. And I use a number of different concepts. One that I developed, back in 2017 with an article I published called Cultural Extractivism, which talks about how powerful entities extract value from marginalized communities. It echoes the idea of extracting resources like coal. I also apply social memory theory with some of the theorists I highlight there. And I also employ a critical hauntology from Derrida and Gillock and others, which examines how the past returns in physical landscapes and cultural memory. So the paper is really looking at, and this is a part of my book. When I say the paper, this is a piece of my book project that Steve mentioned. It's looking at this relationship between social memory and place by considering these narratives. This is a picture of Centralia when it was a so-called lively town, and after the fire and the town was relocated. And I originally posted this on my social media before I started the site that I created. And I've been working on this project. I'm not actively doing ethnography now, but I've been working on it actively for 7 years. So these are some of the approaches that I use. It's an ethnography and autoethnography because I have grown up in this area, as I mentioned. So I'm looking at, as I said, social memory and industrial decline, class, and environmental inequality, but I use many methods: participant observation, interviews, self-narrative, and autoethnography. This what I call a public digital humanities collaboratory, life histories, and immersion in the contemporary media and images of the coal region. And I contextualize my own experiences growing up and my family's in this region. So the media types that I'm looking at are, as I said, the Silent Hill narrative that is appropriated and transforms Centralia into this supernatural horror trope, the amusement park attraction that commodifies Centralia as hell on earth for commercial profit, these online review platforms that review it as a tourist destination while there's no business or residences or zip code. And then I use my own personal, the Facebook page that I created for the community, where community shares stories about the region, and the researcher created a digital platform. And then I also think through Google's algorithms that prioritize those types of portrayals of Centralia, reinforcing dominant narratives. And then vernacular and community media that end up on those digital platforms, like personal photographs, residents share shots they have taken. I share that side-by-side historical comparison, which is how I really started my digital platform, and then the community narratives that I gather. This is when I originally started. This is going back to 2013. When I originally started the page, I hadn't started the digital platform yet. And I started this on my personal page, and this is how much it circulated. So I realized there was a real need for sharing this information. There's a struggle for meaning about this site. And so that prompted me to then create the Facebook page and investigate the role of digital media. There's about 10,000 people on it. And investigate how participation and digital media would work and follow the people, not just in the offline, but online, because I was doing ethnography, and follow the media and all the metaphors. But it was just me running the show. So I was trying to, much like Monika, create online platforms to balance this. And I did create my own WordPress, but then I was building an Almeca platform that I haven't completed yet. So that's what you see here. These are this is an example of just how much talking people would do about these things and how much memory material that I was gathering. Now I just want to take you into some of the imaginaries that are circulated by the larger community that are not the locals. This is Centralia being transformed into these media representations. This is from Silent Hill. So this I call this mediatization, romanticization, commodification. So it's portrayed as something spectacle worthy. This is from, like I said, that horror film. It's idealized as tragic, haunted. It's turned into a product for consumption. Exoticized is weird, supernatural, and other. So it's this pitting of these two different meanings. So content creators then spread this through tourist sites. They review it on Yelp. Like here's an example of a review: eerie, quiet, weird. Fires are still burning. Stick your hand into the cracks of the silent, I have to move you out of the way here, cracks of the silent highway covered with graffiti, and you will feel the heat. If you walk a bit around, you can see the steam rising up from the cracks. You can feel the heat touching your face. Or was it a ghost? I got chills on the highway to nowhere. And then there's more. People like Adam are upset. I don't want to drive. I don't want to go through all of this with such little time, but he's calling it eerie. He's even disappointed that he comes there and it's not as scary as he thought, because, too many people are there. And he said it's not even spooky, it's spoopy, meaning almost silly, because he wanted it to be scarier. Somebody comes and reenacts Silent Hill. This is one of the bobblehead nurses there, and they come on the graffiti road that's blocked off and they reenact it. This is the graffiti road. This was the Route 61. I used to drive on that when I was a kid to go to my track meets and stuff. And now this is the road, and what's left of it cracked from the heat. And then people mix these images of the horror film with actual images of the town online. This is the amusement park that actually has a Centralia. This is a ride, and it makes it look like it's like burning underneath. That's a town. Whereas these are examples from the community. When they post, they are posting the infrastructure, and they have other things to say. This photo tells you the whole story. They use the digital space to contest these narratives, authentic memories, even frustration with these supernatural interpretations. Eloise goes back to where her grandparents' house was. And this is someone else who goes back to where their great-grandparents' house was. Now you can see there are no houses. Harry has a capitalistic critique. I wonder who capitalized on all the mineral rights where the Mammoth vein was. That's the largest vein that has all of the anthracite coal. So some people suspect that there's all this profit going on, even though there's a mine fire. And there is mining, there's strip mining still going on in Centralia. So I just will offer you some concluding thoughts. The story of Centralia for me is what I'm trying to tell you is it is more about economic disenfranchisement, displacement, and corporate irresponsibility. The fire began in 1962, and then you had this intervention through eminent domain. But what happened was the mining companies sold the mineral rights, sometimes for $1, to avoid responsibility. And you have these homes, and the infrastructure were demolished, But you have these competing narratives over who controls a community's memory when the physical place has been erased. I did use Nora's work. So for residents, and I'm sorry for my French speakers, Centralia becomes a lieu de mémoire. I hope I'm not butchering that. A memory place created through texts, discourses, and mythology. I go to Benjamin, who warned against mass culture's tendency to aestheticize economic processes and trauma, and Centralia's tragedy becomes an aesthetic product divorced from labor history and economic displacement. Residents are then gathering these fragments as Centralia's memory then becomes decontextualized in these larger mediated discourses where visitors may casually consume these aestheticized images. These images become what I take this term punctum from Barth, the industrial punctum. So I say cultural extractivism explains how cultural resources, memories, and narratives are extracted from marginalized communities, which parallels the physical extraction of coal, and the aestheticization of ruin serves economic interests outside the community. And so I borrow this idea of haunts instead of haunted to represent the active ongoing relationship with place. Residents return to Centralia physically and digitally to think about how they're being forgotten. And so maybe digital spaces become new haunts where vernacular memory can challenge dominant narratives. I'm not saying it's a big protest, but it is a way to have some kind of search engine optimization, some kind of presence. Where because modern memory is increasingly shaped by algorithms that privilege certain narratives, and search engines accumulate behavioral surplus from user activity. What they do have is that the typical search would put Silent Hill at the top. So the political economy of these search engines marginalize local memories in favor of profitable horror narratives. And that's all I have for you. So thank you. Try to get this off.
Well, thanks so much, Melissa. Yeah, like really, like it speaks to me. I've done a lot of work on sort of the deindustrial sublime and how loss gets commodified, ruin porn and so on. And I think what you're doing here is really interesting. And of course, like a Facebook group, 10,000 people, and I'd assume you'd have like both, residents and sort of external consumers all in that space negotiating, and it's to be a messy space, right? You'd have both those tropes, coexisting or perhaps, confronting each other. Anyways, very, very interesting. So
It turned into a space where they didn't actually come very much in there. It was mostly just the community talking.
Okay, well that's interesting too, right? Like why that would be, and yeah, but no, very, very interesting. I haven't seen Silent Hill, so I gotta. Although the horror genre sort of creeps me out a little bit. So
I don't love horror genre myself, but it's not. I don't want to be a critic of it. Just on a separate.
No.
But it's not my favorite.
Yeah. So let's open it up to questions. We have, I guess, a half hour to sort of chew on these 7 presentations. There's clearly linkages. Some of you were referring to them already. Who wants to start us off? Just raise your electronic hand